Hey guys, in this video we're looking at power and conflict poetry, focusing on the poem Checking Out My History, which was written by John Agard. So, it was written by John Agard in 2007. As a Caribbean poet living in Britain, Agard uses his voice to confront the way colonial education systems bandage the eyes of students by erasing non-European history. Based on the personal experience of being colonised, it follows the speaker's frustration with being taught trivial British nursery rhymes and white historical figures, whilst the great leaders of his own ancestral warriors, healers, and revolutionaries were kept in the dark. The main message is that knowledge is power, and denying someone their history is a form of control. The poem highlights that identity is something you must carve out for yourself. By reclaiming the stories of his ancestors, the speaker moves from being a passive victim of education to an active, empowered individual. The bandage and blind imagery symbolize how the education system physically restricts his vision. The irony lies in the fact that while he was taught about Dick Whittington and Hecate, he was never taught about the firewoman Nanny of the Maroons, proving that the British curriculum focused on myths while ignoring the real human struggle for freedom. Key ideas in checking out history are as follows. So we look at the struggle for identity. The speaker is in a state of rebellion against the Eurocentric education that has blinded him to his own heritage. By contrasting British nursery rhymes with Caribbean revolutionaries, the poem shows that identity is not something given by the state, but something the individual must carve out by reclaiming their own hidden history. It looks at knowledge as power and control. So Agard presents the education system as a colonial tool of suppression. The metaphors of bandage up me eye and blind me to my identity prove that by controlling what a person learns, the rulers control how that person sees themselves. History is used as a weapon to keep the colonized person in a state of intellectual submission. It looks at the power of oral tradition and folklore. So the italicized sections for heroes like Toussaint Louverture and Nanny of the Maroons use lyrical, natural imagery, firewoman, mountain dream, healing star. This contrasts with the great repetitive nursery rhyme style of British history, suggesting that the speaker's true history is more vibrant, spiritual, and life-giving than the one he was forced to learn. It looks at reclaiming the voice. So the poem is written in patois, which is Caribbean phonetic spelling, to actively reject the rules of standard English. By refusing to follow traditional grammar and punctuation, Agard carves out his voice on the page, and the final realization is that history is not just about the past, but about having the light to create a future that belongs to him. Let's have a look at the structure of the poem. So, it's written in two contrasting styles. The poem alternates between stanzas with simple bouncy rhyme schemes AABB for British history, mimicking childish nursery rhymes, and its italicized free-verse stanzas for Caribbean heroes. This shows that British history is presented as trivial or make-believe, while its own history is serious, epic, and organic. It uses a lack of punctuation, so Agard uses almost no full stops or commas, and this represents a rejection of the rules of the British establishment and creates a sense of an unstoppable, flowing stream of consciousness. It shows that the speaker is no longer willing to be contained by the structures of his rulers. It uses phonetic spelling, also known as patois, and words like dem, me, and wid are used to establish a strong Caribbean oral voice. This is a political act. It forces the reader to acknowledge the speaker's culture and proves that his identity is stronger than the standard English he was taught. It looks at a repetitive refrain of "dem tell me." The poem opens and repeats the phrase "dem tell me," "what dem want to tell me." This emphasizes the passive role the speaker was forced into, and the shift at the end to "I carving out me identity" marks the climax where he becomes the active creator of his own story. Let's have a look at the context of the poem. So, it's written in the Eurocentric curriculum, and Agard challenges the British education system of the late 20th century, which often ignored the contributions of non-white figures. By focusing on 1066 and Dick Whittington, the system acted as a colonial tool, reinforcing the idea that white European history is the only history that matters. It looks at colonialism and language. So, as a Guyanese poet, Agard uses patois, which is known as Caribbean dialect, as a form of rebellion. In the context of the British Empire, standard English was often forced upon colonized people to strip them of their heritage. By writing "dem tell me," Agard is reclaiming his linguistic roots and rejecting the rules of his colonizers. The hidden heroes. So the poem highlights real historical figures such as Toussaint Louverture, who led the Haitian Revolution, and Mary Seacole, who was a Jamaican nurse in the Crimean War. Agard presents these figures as beacons of light, contrasting them with the nursery rhyme versions of British history that he was taught. It looks at reclaiming a personal narrative, so like Garland's focus on psychology, Agard explores the mental impact of colonization. He argues that being denied your history is a form of spiritual blinding, and the poem isn't just about the past, it's a clinical tool at how individual must carve through layers of propaganda to find their true self. Let's look at the actual poem. So, here is the poem. You're more than welcome to pause the video and have a look and press play when you want to carry on. Let's do a line-by-line analysis. So, them tell me, what them want to tell me shows anaphora and plosives, and the repetition of them, also meaning them, at the start of the lines creates a confrontational rhythmic beat. The method is that the hard D sounds act like a drum beat, signalling the speaker's anger. It establishes a passive identity, where the speaker is merely a vessel for the information the rulers choose to provide. Bandage up me eye with me own history, blind me to me own identity, shows a metaphor, and usually bandages are for healing, but here they're used to obstruct vision. This irony shows that education, which should enlighten, was used as a tool of colonial control to hide the speaker's true heritage from him. Them tell me about 1066 and all that. Them tell me about Dick Whittington and he cat. But Toussaint Louverture, no, them never tell me about that. Shows juxtaposition as Agard places a major historical date, 1066, next to a nursery rhyme, Dick Whittington, and this mocks the British curriculum, suggesting it treats history like a childish myth. By contrasting these with Toussaint, a real revolutionary, he highlights the mission of black excellence. Toussaint, a slave with vision, lick-back, Napoleon, battalion, and first black, republic born, Toussaint the Thorn, to the French, Toussaint the Beacon, shows free verse and italics, and the rhythm breaks away from the nursery rhyme beats into a jagged organic form. And the metaphor of Toussaint as a beacon introduces the theme of light, representing the truth that shines through the blindfold of colonial education. Them tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow who jumped over the moon. Them tell me about the dish ran away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny the Maroon. It's a rhyme scheme, as the AABB bouncy rhyme scheme sounds like a nursery rhyme, and this makes British history appear fictional and irrelevant. The mention of Nanny the Maroon, who was a leader of Jamaican resistance, acts as a fire imagery that burns through the trivial stories of spoons and cows. Nanny, sea far woman of mountain dream, fire woman struggle, hopeful stream, to freedom river. Natural imagery, as Agard uses stream, mountain, and river to describe Nanny, and this suggests that his history is organic and spiritual, connected to the earth, unlike the dry history of British kings and queens. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shaka the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus and 1492, but what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks too? This parallelism, as a repetition of them tell me about, shows how systematic the blindness is. And here he's critiquing the discovery narrative of Columbus, pointing out that the state hides the suffering of indigenous people, Caribs and Arawaks, to maintain a glorious version of history. Them tell me about Florence Nightingale and She Lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Them tell me about Old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary Seagull is a mocking tone, as pairing Florence Nightingale with the fictional Robin Hood suggests her story has been mythologized by the British. From Jamaica, she ship her own well, check the dying, a yellow sunrise, to the dying, a healing star among the dead is the next quote. This is a celestial metaphor, as Mary Seagull is a healing star, and this symbolism of light contrasts with the bandage at the start of the poem, and she provides the sunrise needed to wake the speaker from his colonial slumber. Them tell me, what them want to tell me, but now I can't checking out my own history. I carving out my identity is a volta in the poem, also known as a turning point, and here the speaker shifts from being a passive recipient to an active creator, and the verb carving implies a physical, difficult, and permanent process. The poem ends on a note of empowerment. By finding his history, he has the tools to carve a future that finally belongs to him, moving from blindness to vision. So let's have a look at doing a section by section analysis. So in stanza 1, which is the blindfold, what happens is the speaker introduces the rulers who control the education system. He explains how he was force-fed a selective Eurocentric vision of history, while his own ancestral heritage was deliberately hidden from him. The bandage and blind imagery establishes the education system as a physical and mental sensory deprivation. It proves that the rulers use history as a weapon of colonial control, ensuring that the speaker remained a passive victim who could only see the world through a British lens. The techniques to highlight are the metaphor in Bandage Up My Eye, anaphora and plosives in Them Tell Me, and irony in bandages used to harm rather than heal. Stanzas 2 to 5 show trivial myths versus epic reality, and what happens is Agard lists official British history, 1066, Dick Whittington, and the Battle of Waterloo, using a bouncy nursery rhyme rhythm. He interrupts these with the stories of Toussaint Louverture and Nanny of the Maroons, described in serious italicized free verse. And the effect of this is that the juxtaposition makes British history look like a childish myth or joke compared to the raw natural power of his own heroes. Toussaint is a beacon, and Nanny is a firewoman, suggesting that black history is vibrant and life-giving, whereas the colonial version is dry and irrelevant. And the techniques to highlight are juxtaposition, free verse, light imagery. Stanzas 6 to 8 show the beacon of truth. What happens is the speaker continues to contrast British figures such as Lord Nelson, Florence Nightingale, with his own hidden heroes, Shaka Zulu and Mary Seacole, and he notes how the state mythologizes white history while airbrushing the suffering of indigenous people like the Caribs and the Arawaks. The effects of this is the use of celestial imagery such as hailing star and yellow sunrise to describe Mary Seacole marks a turning point. These figures provide the light needed to burn through the bandages, and it proves that finding your own history is a spiritual awakening that provides the vision to see your own worth. And the main techniques to highlight here are parallelism, celestial metaphor, and intertextuality. Stanza 9 shows a revolution, and what happens here is the poem reaches its climax. The speaker shifts from the passive them tell me to the active I checking out and I carving. He declares that he's taken control of his own education and identity. And the Volta, which is a turning point here, signals a transformation from a victim to an empowered individual. The verb carving suggests that identity is not something handed to you. It is a permanent, laborious act of creation. The irony is resolved. The state tried to blind him, where his ancestors gave him the tool to see. The main techniques to highlight here are the Volta, which is an active metaphor, as well as the first-person narrative. Let's look at the overall interpretation here. So we can see it says, John Agard's Checking Out History explores the profound disconnect between the colonial myth of a civilized education and the agonizing reality of an individual being erased by their own curriculum. Through a transition from mocking nursery rhyme rhythms to a vibrant, fire-filled spiritual history, the poem depicts the speaker as a man who chooses to tear off the bandages of the state, refusing to remain a ghost in a history book that doesn't mention him. The poem suggests that Eurocentric bias leaves an indelible blindness on the mind, transforming the innocent process of learning into a learned, silent suppression of black identity. By the end, the realization that he must carve out his own truth reveals a bitter truth, that cultural erasure is a lethal force, as the student is defeated by a lack of representation rather than a lack of intelligence. The hailing star and beacon presence of his ancestors confirms that while knowledge and time is stronger than humans, the human capacity for resilience through self-discovery is equally absolute. This leaves the reader with fire-bright realization. The irony exposes the reader's foolishness, showing that the glory of a one-sided history is a lie, that for those who seek the truth ends in a powerful and self-sanctioned psychological rebirth. So when we're talking about this poem in our essays, we have to make sure we mention the following points. We have to look at the rebellious voice. So unlike the passive soldiers and exposure, the speaker is actively checking out and carving out his own path. He refuses to be a victim of the incantations of the state and looks at nature as an ancestor. So the contrast between the cow jump over the moon and the mountain dream of Nanny the Maroon. While nature is a killer and exposure, here is a source of spiritual light and lineage. It looks at chaos versus control, so the use of a broken, unpunctuated structure to represent the speaker's freedom from the standard rules of the British establishment, and it rejects the rigid 8-stanza trap of poems like Exposure. It looks at the intellectual rebirth, so the removal of the bandage mirrors, the eyes melting. Both poems deal with a moment of clarity, but Agard leads to empowerment rather than the shriveling of the spirit. It looks at the futility of erasure. The final lines show that the rulers failed. Despite their efforts to blind him, he has found his light. And it proves that power is temporary, but a reclaimed history is permanent. Let's look at what poems you can compare with Checking Out History. So we can compare Checking Out History with London. Similarities are as follows. So we have systemic oppression. Both poets argue that people are trapped by systems created by those in power. In Checking Out History, the education system blinds the speaker to his heritage. In London, the chartered streets and mind-forged manacles show how the government and the church control every aspect of life. Both poems present a world where the rulers dictate the narrative. It looks at the use of sound and rhythm. So both poems use a strong repetitive rhythm to mirror the sense of confinement. Blake uses a relentless iambic tetrameter to reflect the marks of weakness and marks of woe in every face he meets, whereas Agard uses a bouncy nursery rhyme rhythm to show how trivialized his education was. Both use these rhythms to highlight the monotony of oppression. It looks at the visual imagery of restriction. So both poets use imagery of physical binding to describe psychological control. Agard speaks of bandage of eye, whilst Blake hears the mind-forged manacles. Both metaphors stress that the most effective form of control is one that makes the victim believe they cannot see or move freely. Differences between the poems are as follows. So it looks at the outcome of the conflict. London is a poem of utter despair. It ends with the marriage hearse, suggesting a cycle of misery that cannot be escaped. In contrast, Checking Out My History is a poem of empowerment. It moves from the passive them tell me to the active I carving, showing that the individual can break their chains through self-discovery. He looks at the target of rebellion. So Blake's anger is directed at the institutions of his own city, for example, the palace, the church, the blackening chimney sweepers. Agard's anger, however, is directed at a colonial legacy and an education system that tried to replace his identity with a foreign one. Blake's struggle is class-based and local, whilst Agard's is racial and historical. And it also looks at the imagery of light and dark. So London is a poem of night and blackening, where even the appalled church is covered in soot. Checking Out My History uses imagery of light, beacon, healing star, and sunrise are common quotes to represent the hidden history. For Agard, the light of the past offers a way out, whereas for Blake, the darkness of the city is all-consuming. We can also compare Checking Out My History with the Prelude, so similarities are as follows. We have a moment of realization, known as the Volta. Both poems feature a pivotal moment where the speaker's perspective changes forever. In the Prelude, it is the sight of the huge peak that terrifies the rower. In Checking Out My History, it's the discovery of hidden heroes. Both poets show that true education happens outside of a traditional classroom setting. Another similarity is the power of the unknown. So both speakers are confronted by something massive that they weren't prepared for. Wordsworth is humbled by the black desertion of nature's power, whilst Agard is humbled by the vision of Tucson and Nanny. Both poems suggest that there are forces, nature or history, much larger than the individual. And the similarity is internal transformation. So the speakers do not end the poem the same way they started. Wordsworth's mind is filled with huge and mighty storms, whilst Agard's mind is filled with beacons and fire. Both poets use imagery of the mind to show that our thoughts are the most important territory we own. Differences between the poems are like this. So a difference is a source of knowledge. In the Prelude, the teacher is the natural world, the mountain. It's a spiritual pantheistic experience. And in Checking Out My History, the teacher is ancestral heritage. Agard's enlightenment is political and cultural, whereas Wordsworth is philosophical and solitary. Another difference is positive versus negative epiphany. So Wordsworth's experience is a trouble to my dreams. He is left feeling small and insignificant. Agard's experience is empowering. He feels larger and more complete. While Wordsworth is blinded by the terror of the mountain, Agard removes his bandages to finally see clearly. Another difference is the language of rebellion. So Agard uses patois to actively fight back against the standard English of his rulers. Wordsworth uses epic poetry and sophisticated iambic pentameter, which actually fits perfectly into the British literary canon. Agard breaks the rules to find himself, whereas Wordsworth follows the rules to describe a moment where he felt lost. Let's look at key quotes to revise for Checking Out My History then. So we have the key quotes here. We have them tell me, what them want to tell me, which shows anaphora and plosives, and the repetition of the hard D sounds creates a confrontational drum-like beat. And this establishes a passive identity. The speaker is merely a vessel for the information the rulers choose to provide. It highlights the power imbalance between the state and the individual. Bandage up me eye with me own history, blind me to me own identity is a metaphor, as usually bandages are for healing, but here they're used to obstruct vision. This irony shows that education was used as a tool of colonial control by blinding him to his roots, and the state ensured he could only see the world through a Eurocentric lens. Toussaint, a slave, with vision, lick back Napoleon is free verse and short lines, as the rhythm breaks away from the bluesy nursery rhyme into a jagged or organic form. And the method here is the broken structure represents Toussaint breaking his literal and metaphorical chains. It contrasts the vision of the black hero with the blindness imposed by the British school system. A yellow sunrise to the dying, a healing star among the dead, shows a celestial metaphor, as Mary Seacole is described using symbols of light and stars. And the method here is that this imagery of light directly counters the bandage at the start of the poem. It proves that reclaiming hidden history provides the spiritual vision needed to break the speaker from colonial suppression. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shaka the Great Zulu, shows parallelism and juxtaposition, as Agard places European victories next to African military greatness. And by highlighting the omissions of history, he exposes how the state mythologizes white figures whilst airbrushing black power. It proves that the glory of the British curriculum is a half-truth. But now I checking out my own history. I carving out my own identity is a volatile and active metaphor, as the shift from the passive them tell me to the active I carving marks a climax. And the verb carving implies a difficult, physical, and permanent act of creation. It proves that identity is not something handed to you by a ruler. It is something you must actively craft once you have removed the state's bandages.